Welcome everyone, I'm Emily Hallinan and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at ICArEHB here in Faro. And this year I'm joined by Carlos Simoes, Anna Rufa and Sarah Rhodes in organising our dialogue series. The first ICArEHB Dialogues took place last year on the topics of origins, and the aim of our format was not only to represent the breadth of the research that we cover at our centre, but also we wanted to engage with leading experts from the wider academic community. In creating this dialogue between our two researchers on big themes in human, biological and cultural evolution, we wanted to invite you, our colleagues across the world, to join with this conversation. This year, we're addressing the theme of migrations and dispersals, with our 4 talks progressing chronologically. So we begin today spanning the Middle and Upper Paleolithic, and our later discussions will focus on the late Pleistocene, the Mesolithic and Neolithic transition, and the Bronze Age. For today's talk, we'll hear from Erella Hovers from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Jonathan Haws, based at the University of Louisville and also affiliated with ICArEHB. Erella is a paleoanthropologist with an interest in transitions, or the lack thereof, seen throughout the long prehistoric record of Africa and the Levant. Her work focuses on lithic technology and its relationship with cognition, and on epistemological approaches to understanding processes of cultural evolution, symbolic behaviour, and prehistoric demography in the archaeological record. Jonathan's research focuses in particular on the Paleolithic of Europe, though he's also been involved in some of ICArEHB's projects in Africa. His recent work at Lapa de Picoeiro in Portugal has revealed insights into early human ecodynamics across the Middle to Upper Paleolithic transition in southwestern Europe. And this has pointed to the arrival of modern humans in the region several thousand years earlier than previously thought. Unfortunately, Erella has been struck down by COVID this week, but she was able to find moments to record her talk. So we're very grateful to her for doing that. And she sends her apologies for not being able to join in with this discussion, but maybe she'll be able to join us in a bit. Just some housekeeping. The format will be that we'll screen both video presentations one after the other, and then we'll open the floor up for questions and discussion. If you think of questions during the talks, please send them directly either to me or to Sarah Rhodes through the Zoom chat feature. And once we enter our dialogue phase, I'll then invite you to unmute yourself and read out your question. Please remain muted during the presentations and in the discussion unless we invite you to unmute yourself, otherwise we'll have chaos. So without further ado, here's our dialogue on migrations and dispersals in the Middle and Upper Paleolithic.
Hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak in this dialogue series. What I would like to do today is think aloud about the Middle Paleolithic in the southern Levant from the perspective of human movements and population dispersals. As can be seen on this map, this is a long and narrow strip of land. It's about 1,000 kilometers north-south, 400 kilometers at the most on the east-west axis, and it has natural boundaries: the Taurus Mountains to the north, the Mediterranean Sea to the west, the desert belt to the south, and it grades into the Syrian and Arabian deserts to the east. With such geographical features, no wonder that when biogeographers, ecologists, paleoanthropologists think about the Levant, they think about a corridor, a land route through which animals, including humans, moved between Eurasia and Africa. We should probably talk about dispersal rather than migration, because dispersal does not assume a designated destination for the movement, which I think should be our null hypothesis. The point is that when we think of the Levant during the Paleolithic, and especially the earlier Paleolithic, the Lower Paleolithic, the Middle Paleolithic, we think about a corridor, or as Ofer Bar Yosef used to say informally, the central bus station of the Paleolithic world. In the southern Levant, the modern states of Israel, of Jordan, Lebanon, southwestern Syria, the topographic complexity is combined with climatic complexity. Based on intensive paleoclimatic research using multiple proxies, the current model suggests that the East Mediterranean atmospheric circulation system interacts with the morphology and location of the southeast Mediterranean coast, and together the combination of these two parameters controls the spatial distribution of rainfall and the wind pattern. In Lebanon, in northern Israel, in northern Jordan, the amounts of rain were relatively high compared to today's conditions, and obviously compared to the south at the same time. As you move south from these areas, from the north of Israel, for example, you move south, you move to the east, we are going through a gradual aridification from semi-arid to arid to hyper-arid areas, so that the southern Negev of Israel, which is considered to be a hyper-arid area today, is only 200 and 250 kilometers south of the wet areas to the north, or relatively wet areas to the north. This area, the southern Negev, does get some rain from the Red Sea Trough, but this is very localized rain. So different systems are affecting the landscape that hominins were experiencing and living in during the late Middle and late Pleistocene. And as said, presumably the same climatic and obviously topographic factors also interacted for earlier comparable climatic periods during the Middle Paleolithic, here from 200,050 to about 50,000 years ago, with the changes in climatic conditions from warmer to colder periods, throughout which we have human populations in the area. This diversity of environments and ecological niches that is created by the combination of topography and climate obviously has implications for the resources available and the resource availability to hominins. So if you look at resource availability, it is determined by two factors. It is the gross resource supply on the x-axis here, and the resource uptake on the y-axis here. Resource availability increases when the difference between gross resource supply and resource uptake is increased. So this can happen when there is more resources, A to B, when there is less demand, less uptake, A to C, or any combination of these two. And the susceptibility of a community to invasion increases as resource availability increases. The key implication here is that environments that are subject to frequent fluctuation in resource supply are more open to invasion by species or populations from neighboring areas. Bearing that in mind and remembering the effect of the combined topoclimatic factors on rain distribution and vegetation distributions, we can argue that not all areas of the Levant were hospitable, susceptible to invasion, quote unquote, at any given moment. So they're not equally available for colonization, again, quote unquote, by neighboring communities at any given moment. And of course, there would be also diachronic changes because we have drier and wetter periods. Now imagine we move into a drier climate period and reduce the amount of rainfall by only 10%, a hypothetical. This would have a marginal effect on the north and a detrimental effect on the southern areas. So during such period, if there was any movement into the region, we would not expect to see much in the south, but we would expect to see people moving into the northern areas. So with this as a useful and important background to some of the questions that we address here, let's look at finally the Paleolithic record at the Levant, and I would like to start with the early days, the state of affairs until the late 1980s. And that's because I think this is where much of the tone of the discussion really emerged. So what dominated research at the time? It's Eurocentrism. Europe is the yardstick against which everything is measured. It is a time where with this Eurocentric approach, researchers were trying to build a regional record, and the focus was on stratigraphy and on cultural sequences. Not much could be done in terms of dating at the time, so early 20th century. In terms of material culture, the Middle Paleolithic was typed as a typical Mousterian, and a three-stage developmental model was based on the sequence from Tabun. A little bit more on this later. As I said, chronology was not really a chronology, it's a relative chronology based on material culture changes and their stratigraphic position. And the sites that were excavated were mainly stratified cave sites. In one of these caves at Schul, a group of skeletons was found that, in retrospect, we can tell started to throw or at least threaten the Eurocentric point of view. The story is well known. It was a bunch of hominins that had very different features from those of the known hominins in Europe, the Neanderthals that had been associated with the same material culture, what was called the Mousterian at that time. Because they were so different, they were first named Paleoanthropus palestinensis, and then it was switched to Homo sapiens. And here is how Gerold, almost 30 years after the discovery, reflects on it. Was this a creature in the throes of evolutionary change? Was it a hybrid? Did it represent transitional stage leading from a pre-Mousterian Homo sapiens to Homo neanderthalensis? I'm dwelling on this point because this dichotomy, the sapiens versus Neanderthals, is really something that dictated the tone of the discussion on the Middle Paleolithic of the Levant and what was happening there for years to come in the history of research. Technology to the rescue, dating revolution, and a change of paradigm. I think one can justifiably argue that this starts at the Levant. So 1985, this is basically Jelinek's view. We have Neanderthals, Kebara, Tabun, Amud, known when he was working at Tabun, at the base of the Middle Paleolithic sequence, followed by Kafze and Schul, modern humans. 1987, the TL dates were published for Kafze, and Kafze moved from around 50,000 years old to being about 90,000 years old. Amud, Tabun, and Kebara did not move because they were not dated. Schul did not move because it was not dated. Fast forward 1993, here is the situation. All these sites were dated. Kebara and Amud are indeed late, but later. The Neanderthals there are later than Kafze and Schul. Tabun, Oi is a big headache. The different dating method did not agree, but basically, and for various reasons, to which I don't want to go now, it just would be too long. The TL chronology of Tabun is considered, or at least I think it is more reliable than the ESR, at least at that time. Maybe new results would show differently, but at the time these results were more reliable, and therefore Tabun, with its Neanderthal, regardless of whether it was in B or in C, is older than Schul and Kafze. So we have a situation that we are not familiar with in Europe, suggesting a strange dynamic in terms of the hominin species involved in the creation and the making of a single technocomplex, the Mousterian or the Middle Paleolithic technocomplex in the Levant. So following the dating revolution, several things should be mentioned. First, we have a much longer Middle Paleolithic. The dates, I think, are the thing that is less controversial in nowadays Middle Paleolithic studies in the Levant. Everybody accepts that we actually do talk about a period of about 200,000 years. That's one thing. We have the model of Tabun, the three-stage model of Tabun, if you will, that Gerard developed and abandoned. So she did see the stratification in Tabun itself, but she did not think it was a model for the whole of the Levant. This is an idea that was actually perpetuated by Copland based on her work in Sarakil, and she argued for a Tabun D-type industry with elongated points, with a lot of retouch and a unidirectional flaking. The points and the blade industry as such, so we see it in Mislia, we see some of it at Hayonim, could be both Levallois and non-Levallois methods of flaking. Then we have Tabun C, which Copland characterized as Levallois facies with a centripetal flaking and therefore large oval or circular flakes. And then we have Tabun B-type industries with broad-based points associated or resulting from unidirectional convergent flaking. But she did manage, emphasized that they occur with a plethora of other flaking system modes and methods in the same assemblage. Because Tabun C type is reportedly associated with the Schul hominins, and because the material from Kafza is really centripetal and associated with the modern humans of Kafza, this became a synonym. They became synonym almost to one another. So centripetal means modern humans, and the same for the Neanderthals and the ball-based point, to the degree that some researchers even suggest that this such and such a site is a Neanderthal site based on the lithics without having a sliver of a human skeleton remain in them. So this is disturbing, I think, state of affairs, but this is also something that is important for the issue of dispersals, because people have argued for dispersing population based on the lithics, not necessarily based on the presence of skeletal remains. So we have two populations in the same area using Middle Paleolithic lithic technology based on the archaeological material, using the same resources and using it in pretty much the same way. So it's not very easy to explain how they exist in the same area. Here comes to the rescue the Levantine corridor and the movement of populations through the corridor. The argument being that there is out of Africa, I just mentioned here some of the references that formalized the model in its early stages, although I would note that biological anthropologists argued for out of Africa based on skeletal material, on skeletal evidence, before the genetic revolution and dating revolution. There is out of Europe and into the Levant, because Neanderthals, as we understand, is a European clade, a European population, and they arrived to the Levant from Europe. And Bar Yosef suggested that this happened due to their desire to avoid harsh climatic conditions. So some groups, at least, managed to disperse into the Levant. The incompatibility of both groups living at the same area at the same time was explained as a discontinuous occupation. So again, a lot of movement, populations coming and going, and moving back to Africa. The genetic evidence cited here for back to Africa is actually not for the Middle Paleolithic, it's for later material, later periods, but again, not something that we cannot imagine, because a corridor is obviously open for traffic both ways. So the gist of the matter is that we are looking at arguments that, yes, they came here, but they did not stay here permanently or not continuously throughout the way. They came, they went, depending on the opposition, so to speak. So let's take a look at some behavioral features observed archaeologically that can speak to continuity, change, diffusion of ideas, diffusion of technologies into and out of the Levant. And I think when you look at the colors, even without reading the graph, you can see a mixed bag. I'll focus here on the lithics because this is the best known and the most available material. So we look at flake industries. This is something that started already before, but now we lost the bifaces. Kina flaking, which was part of the late Lower Paleolithic sequence, and bifacial shaping disappear completely. The use of Levallois method is something that does appear, and it's used to make all sorts of artifacts, the flakes, the blades, and the points. The use of Levallois is modular in the sense that we have preferential and recurrent methods, and they are combined variably with the modes of core preparation, the centripetal, the unidirectional, or the bidirectional or unidirectional convergent. So you can find all sorts of variation of the Levallois in the Middle Paleolithic record. Contrary to some argument, the way the core is prepared is flexible in the sense that things change throughout the reduction sequence. This is based on refitting studies in a large number of sites and on statistical and metrical analysis of material from other sites. So it's a flexible system. There is a preference, but it's flexible. It's not a Catholic relationship between a napper and a specific way of making the core or producing the flakes. The Levallois system is always associated with other, probably more than other, one other flaking system. So again, a variable mix of things. And in all the assemblages, and most of the assemblages, there is a considerable use of cores on flakes. So if I have to characterize the lithic assemblages as a whole thing, it's flexibility, it's the use of Levallois with other things, the use of flexible and diverse Levallois methods. It's a combination that is working or is applied according to need based on a pool of technological knowledge and behavioral and cultural norms. So some examples from early Middle Paleolithic assemblages. I think the similarities are quite obvious. There are elongated pieces, there are some pointed pieces, some are Levallois, some are not. In these and some other, not very many early Middle Paleolithic sites that we know, there is a narrow range of technological practices that are applied to the material. It's a very similar range in all sites, but it's not a single method ever. Some material from Nesher Ramla, from the site of Dimona, a Nubian core, and we can see we're looking at the stage 5 probably for all these three sites. And yes, it's centripetal, but not only centripetal. Some points from sites such as Amud and Kabara compared to some points from at the top from Mislia, for example. You can see the similarities as well as some differences. So again, Levallois is applied in slightly different ways in each case. And the variability of, as I said, accentuated variability of the late Middle Paleolithic. We can see here a centripetal core, a unidirectional, a convergent core, some single platform cores, which one would normally associate with the Upper Paleolithic rather than the Middle Paleolithic. And something that was not really expected, a bladelet production. and intentional belated production in some of the later sites. A reminder of the Tabun model, this time with the specimen from Islia associated with an early Middle Paleolithic industry, same chronology as we saw before. And I want to ponder the question whether time really will tell us about the relationship between the populations and the industries and their interconnection. I have argued that the discontinuous appearances of Neanderthals and modern humans is partly the result of the way we treat the data. It's the resolution of the dates, which is not very good always. It's the number of sites that we date, because the focus is on sites that do have hominin remains, but we don't necessarily always treat in the same manner, and we don't always invest the same effort in dating sites that do not have hominin remains. But obviously, if you have a site, a hominin, either a Neanderthal or a modern or maybe somebody else, made these materials. So what we are looking at is a subsample, a very biased and distorted, I think, a sample. And the more points of data we will have, we would be able to see more continuity between the various archaeological layers, and by implication also between the appearance or the existence of the different hominin types. Similarly, in a situation where we have more than one type, if you will, of hominin making stone tools, we cannot attribute a priori and without checking and without verifying the identity of the stone tool maker, the tools to one or another specimen. This works in Europe, where you have only Neanderthals, so everything made in the Middle Paleolithic is attributed to Neanderthal. Until now, there has been no reason to reject or refute this hypothesis. But this is not something that we can assume a priori in the Levant. So we need to look at the assemblages, at the fossils, at the dates, and put them together and see what the situation really is. Indeed, there have been already some suggestions, some scenario talking about a more continuous coexistence of the population. The first one actually suggests that there is no coexistence because there are no two populations. Yes, there is input, again, the movement into the Levant, very strong gene flow from Africa, a minor role of gene flow from Europe, and this works to create a very diverse and single viable population in the area, the first model of Ernstburg and Belfer-Cohen. Another model suggested coexistence with limited contact, where the contact is regulated and controlled by cultural mechanisms, including territoriality, a sort of a good fences make good neighbors kind of scenario. This is ecologically feasible. Some people find it difficult because of the small area involved, but this is ecologically feasible. A very old model by Van der Mesch in 1982 is the model of continuous existence, which seems to have been resurrected, although not accredited to Van der Mesch, by the Nesher Homo Ramle scenario of a locally evolving population in the region throughout the earlier Middle Paleolithic, from Ezutie, the Acheulean progenitor, at least to the times of Schul and Kafze. So there is a local population, and why not? Why should we expect that either moderns or Neanderthals, when they arrived to the area, did not find anyone living here? This is not really realistic. So there is a local population evolving here, and Neanderthals and moderns meet this population and probably interbreed with it when they arrive to the region. So yes, there are more than two populations here. And finally, although there are no genetic data from the Levant, it does not preserve well in this area, indirect genetic hints based on finds from other areas and from other scenarios suggest an early interbreeding event in the Levant around 100,000 years old. So some indications for a limited or more, less limited continuous coexistence in the region. And I think this is very beautifully summarized in this graphic. I thank Yossi Zeidner for allowing me to use it. You can see here the modern humans, the Neanderthals, the Nesher Homo Ramle, and some sites that are dated do not have specimens, and as you can see the different dating methods, so I will not go into all the details because this is really a very loaded graphic, but note that it is plotted against the climatic signal here on the right. And as predicted, we are starting to see some overlaps and some bridging of the gaps between Neanderthals, modern humans, and other populations that may have been in the area. So yes, there is a movement, there is spread, there are probably local populations, and not everyone that got here actually left. So quite a dense area at some point in time where a lot of interesting ecological and social interactions are taking place. If we accept that lithic technology as a cultural behavior stems or is associated with the norms and paradigms and pool of knowledge of social groups, then we probably should consider looking at two scales of social processes that shape the variability of lithic production and which create what we call the Middle Paleolithic of the Levant. So the Levantine Mousterian, as Ofer Bar Yosef called it, here shown in pink, has a place and a time span that is unique to it, as well as a cultural or technological affinities that distinguish it from other Middle Paleolithic entities around it. It is, yes, a cultural history scenario, but one that makes sense given the nature of the region and the nature of the populations that interact here. So it is based on the appearance of Levallois, but also on the availability of raw materials and what people were attempting to do and able to do, and the various ways that they have to do it. So the ways of doing it are not monotonous throughout this long time span. The emergence, what we call the emergence of the Middle Paleolithic, the early Middle Paleolithic, does seem to be an innovation, maybe brought into the region by an expanding or dispersing group from maybe Africa. I don't know if we can really pinpoint the finger this direction. It's a very dramatic change in material culture. So this is something that comes from outside the region, it would seem, even though we still entertain the thought of a locally evolving population, similar to Homo Nesher Ramle, for example, that is developing in the area since the times of Zutie. So this cultural innovation is meshed with maybe a group that is already here in the region. At the local scale, there is variability that stems from the social intimacy involved in the study and learning and transferring information about making stone tools, because this is something that, as Gil Tostevan has argued, should be done in a very close quarters. And this can be summarized here. We have a regional tradition that dictates the similarities, and we have the local traditions that will result in the differences in the specific gestures and ways of making things that are learned at the group level and at close social contact. Be that as it may, it seems that there was a period of coexistence of Neanderthals and modern humans and maybe other taxa. We saw that even though we have this large social scale process that unifies everything, there were a lot of small scale differences that suggest less connectivity or limited connectivity between these groups. The fact is that either one of these groups did not move out of the Levant until very late in the game. And one possible scenario is attributing this to a disease, Cold War, where finally modern humans were the ones that established a better immune system and were able to reproduce more successfully, overcome disease, very relevant to our days, and move out of the Levant to northern Neanderthal, if you will, homelands. And finally, after a long time of maybe a long time of coexistence in the Levant, the modern humans moved out of the region, and the interaction of the technology that they bring with them with the local technological traditions of various groups across the European landscape is what created this tapestry of initial Upper Paleolithic industries that we see in Europe sprouting almost at the same time everywhere. And I thank Aaron Statz for the permission to use this graphic that he created, and handing it from here to Jonathan. Thank you very much.
In this brief presentation, I'll outline and discuss the current state of our knowledge of modern human dispersals in Western Eurasia, emphasizing the timing and process. My own work is focused on the western margin, so I'll focus on the problem from this perspective. I hope that this will set the stage for stimulating and fruitful discussion afterward. The question of modern human dispersal is one of the central issues in paleoanthropology and Paleolithic archaeology today. It's been especially so since the 1987 publication by Kahn, Stone, King, and Wilson that documented the origins of our species some 200,000 years ago in Africa using mitochondrial DNA sequences of modern peoples. This led to an immediate reaction by Paleolithic archaeologists who sought to incorporate this new data into existing models. It generated a couple of significant volumes by Mellers and Stringer, Human Revolution, The Emergence of Modern Humans, that set the stage for 30 plus years now of intense research activity, the generation of new data, heated debates and vociferous arguments, and expansion of research into new geographic areas. This is also a time period of tremendous developments in radiocarbon dating, for instance. AMS had been developed previous to the Kahn, Stone, King, and Wilson study, and the use of AMS dating also revolutionized our understanding of the timing of the Middle and Upper Paleolithic, at least in Western Europe especially. We've also seen subsequently important developments in radiocarbon dating, ultrafiltration in the early 2000s, and the development of calibration curves that now go back to 55,000 years ago or so. In recent decades, we've also seen the developments in uranium series and OSL dating, so we have a somewhat clearer age control, but precision is still a major problem given the constraints of the limits of radiocarbon dating and the error ranges in U series and OSL. So when we talk about dispersals, we're talking about the tracking the movement of people. How is that done? Well, it's done in combination of a number of things like genetics, skeletal morphology, archaeological remains, and of course chronology to establish age control for all of these things. In terms of genetics, we've already seen the importance of mitochondrial DNA to this story. Some developments that have taken place, such as PCR amplification of ancient DNA, has enabled researchers to establish new species of ancient humans and also to track relationships between existing groups and within existing groups, such as the Neanderthals. Skeletal morphology has been around obviously for a long time, but the identification of human remains associated with these artifact assemblages has always been a major problem and issue. For instance, in the case of the Châtel-Perronian, it really wasn't until the Saint-Césaire Neanderthal emerged that that industry was thought to be associated with Neanderthals. The initial Upper Paleolithic is another sort of mysterious entity that we'll get to in a little bit, and that is now pretty well established association with anatomically modern humans at Bachokiro. The Aleutian and Proto-Aurignacian are also attributed to modern humans. There are isolated teeth from Grotta del Cavallo that have been identified as modern humans. The Pescara-Kawase modern humans have also been radiocarbon dated, even though they lack archaeological remains. They do fall into the time range. And some of these skeletons have also produced ancient DNA that's enabled us to understand the ancestry of these individuals and their relationship to the pre-existing Neanderthal populations. Archaeological remains pretty much rely on the lithic industries. Technotypological studies are used typically to trace relatedness between these industries and various assemblages from archaeological sites across the region. And again, we've got the initial Upper Paleolithic, Proto-Aurignacian, Aurignacian. These are associated typically with modern humans, largely by the association of those handful of skeletal specimens and the assumption that those are always associated with modern humans. I mentioned some of the developments in age control and chronology rely heavily on AMS, radiocarbon, also U-series, ESR, and now especially OSL dating. This figure, recently published in Nature by Bergström et al., neatly summarizes their results of a study of the genetics of modern human dispersal out of Africa, beginning sometime between 50 and 60,000 years ago, passing through the Levantine corridor, of course, and manifesting itself in various sites in Western Eurasia and also further east. It also documents the main Neanderthal admixture period, as well as Denisovans. The timing here is also interesting because many of those specimens from Western Eurasia show evidence for a fairly recent admixture, suggesting that the potential period of admixture was fairly prolonged, starting anywhere after 60,000 years ago down to probably about 40,000 or so years ago when Neanderthals disappear. It's also important to recognize the geographic overlap in the distributions of these early modern humans and the existing Neanderthal populations. Here in this map produced by Katerina Duca, you can see around 55,000 years ago, arrival of modern humans in the Levant, seen at the Manat Cave, and then a subsequent dispersal through various corridors into Eurasia, into existing Neanderthal territories. Whether or not Neanderthals were still actually present in that in those landscapes is still a matter of debate, but we know, at least from the genetics also, that there was considerable opportunity in terms of geography and time for lots of interactions to take place between the two groups, resulting in admixture and possibly even sharing of ideas. As mentioned previously, several of the specimens that show evidence for a recent Neanderthal ancestry are also associated with the initial Upper Paleolithic, which appears to have its roots somewhere in the Levant region as well. This is a fairly widespread constellation, if you will, of various lithic industries that share a number of common traits we'll get to shortly. Note also that the specimens that have been found further west of Bachokiro and Pescara-Kawase are not associated with necessarily the initial Upper Paleolithic, but with early Upper Paleolithic cultures such as the Proto-Aurignacian or Aurignacian. This begs the question, how many dispersals are we talking about? It's not just a single dispersal out of Africa and spread to the rest of the world, obviously. This is something that happens sort of in fits and starts. There are some perhaps failures, some successes. New groups, new technologies appear and spread along existing networks. You also probably have the further expansion of modern humans with the disappearance of remnant Neanderthal populations further west. So you end up with this east to west transgressive nature of human dispersal into the western part of Eurasia. And of course, the number of these dispersals is dependent on the timing, the chronology of the appearance of these various lithic industries across space. In this case, initial Upper Paleolithic has its origins maybe somewhere around 45 or earlier in the Near East, and then you've got a sequence of perhaps transitional industries like the Bohunician, Lucian, Châtel-Perronian that may simply be part of this constellation of initial Upper Paleolithic industries, followed sequentially by the Proto-Aurignacian and the early Aurignacian. If you'll note that many of these have significant temporal overlaps. So the picture here is quite complicated, although there are others that do see this as a chronostratigraphic sequence where one always precedes the other in archaeological assemblages. One thing that's apparent, though, is that there's considerable regional variation and variability within and between these lithic industries. These may have to do with issues related to the cultural transmission of these ideas, but also could just be situational adaptive responses to environmental situations. So what is the source of all of this variability? Well, it appears that the initial Upper Paleolithic evolves directly out of the Levallois tradition. It conserves several key elements such as platform faceting and based on the production of prismatic cores, resulting in this constellation of the so-called transitional industries across Western Eurasia. And as Kuhn and Swins have noted, it could represent evidence for one or more population dispersal events. It could also reflect diffusion of ideas across interconnected populations, or it could signal technological convergences on a large scale. There's just a lot that we don't know, and there's considerable variability between all the assemblages that are classified as initial Upper Paleolithic. In the Near East, this is manifest in the local industry known as the Amiran. And subsequently, in the Akhmarian, you see a lot of similarities between that assemblage and the subsequent Proto-Aurignacian that spreads widely across Western Eurasia. The association of the initial Upper Paleolithic with modern humans is pretty well established at sites like Kasara Kil and Bachokira. One of the older of these so-called transitional industries, the Bohunician, does show technological affinities with the initial Upper Paleolithic, lending to support to the possibility of even older modern human dispersals out of the Near East. There now appears to be an even earlier appearance of modern humans in Western Eurasia. The recently published work by Slimak et al. At the Grotte Mandrin showing a modern human associated industry sandwiched in between Neanderthal occupations, dated somewhere between 53 and 55,000 years ago, would represent the oldest incursion of modern humans into Western Eurasia. The Mandrin finds are a remarkable discovery and represent a true game changer in our understanding of the dispersal of modern humans into Eurasia. There are clear technological affinities with the Kasara Kil initial Upper Paleolithic, thus raising the question of the timing of the origins of the initial Upper Paleolithic, as well as the place of origin of the initial Upper Paleolithic. The recent study of the chronology of Kasara Kil and other sites in the Near East does show the potential for overlap, temporal overlap between the IUP at Kasara Kil and at the Grotte Mandrin. Note also that this times well with the appearance of modern humans at Manot Cave. So back to the question of the number of dispersals. We've seen earlier the association of the Amiran with initial Upper Paleolithic development in the Near East. There's also the early Akhmarian that's associated with the development of the Proto-Aurignacian and diffusion or spread of that industry across Eurasia as well. We saw in the genetic evidence that there are certain populations that do not share their genes with the modern population and others that do. So there's a lot of variability and variation within this whole process of dispersal. If we look at the Proto-Aurignacian and the early Aurignacian as sort of distinct technological, let's call them techno-complexes, let's say, do these represent subsequent human dispersals, or technological diffusion through existing populations of modern humans. In some cases, yes, this is the first Upper Paleolithic industry to appear in certain regions, and therefore it does likely represent the dispersal of people. And others, in the eastern portion anyway of the region, you can see that this is probably due to technological diffusion through existing populations. So to sort of summarize the dispersal from a more process kind of perspective, what we see in a lot of models for dispersal and the appearance of the early Upper Paleolithic is a heavy reliance on the first appearance dates for modern humans, and by default, of course, the last known occurrence for Neanderthals. And the timing of all of this does suggest a very rapid expansion across Eurasia, especially Western Eurasia, once these technologies appear. There's a heavy reliance by most researchers on this sort of techno-typological evidence from the lithic assemblages, which may represent the spread of people, but also to keep in mind that there were likely numerous failed attempts before successful colonization. So what are those going to look like? And we can look back to an article by William Davies in the early 2000s where he outlined, at least for the Aurignacian, two distinct phases, a pioneer phase and a developed phase. And in that pioneer phase, he saw a lot of lithic assemblages that did not have, a lot of distinct typological elements in them. They did not have the well-developed bone tool industries of the later Aurignacian, for instance, right? A heavy reliance on the expedient use of locally available raw materials. People are on the move. They're largely centered on riparian zones and also coastal regions. These are probably fairly small pioneer groups budding off of maybe slightly larger populations, and they may or may not be going into vacant territory. We can also look at some kind of larger issues here, like climate. What role did climate play? There does seem to be a correspondence between the Greenland interstadials and the appearance of the initial Upper Paleolithic at places like Mandrin, which dates within the Greenland interstadial 14, or Tolbor in Mongolia that dates to Greenland interstadial 12. The Proto-Aurignacian also seems to be associated with interstadial prior to Heinrich event 4. But then also we have to think about the human populations that were there already, the Neanderthals. We've seen very rapid spread of modern humans across southern Asia and into a whole variety of different kinds of environments, tropical forests and savannas, desert regions and things like that. And there may have been pre-existing human populations there that they either assimilated or replaced. So did the Neanderthals play a hindrance to movements? Were they slowing down the spread of modern humans due to their own population densities? Or were they acting really as facilitators of sharing this accumulated landscape knowledge of new environments, of new landscapes that modern humans were encountering? The genetic evidence of admixture does suggest considerable interaction between the two populations, and the likelihood of sharing of this kind of landscape knowledge is pretty high, and that probably explains some of the spread of these lithic industries. So there's probably a little bit of both. In some cases, they're kind of holding out, maybe towards the west, and in other areas where they're integrating into modern human populations, they're helping this whole process of ultimately of replacement. As Kuhnens-Wins noted, though, we're looking at multiple processes that involve the migration of peoples, cultural transmission of information between groups, within groups. You also have technological convergence. These are vast geographic areas that may or not be connected too well in terms of human populations. And so you could definitely see some potential for convergence in different ideas in finding solutions to various problems in adaptation. So what happened to the Neanderthals? Well, debate has largely revolved around the notions of acculturation versus assimilation. We do have more recent models that have invoked climate change or catastrophic geologic events like the Campanian Ignimbrite explosion that may have decimated Neanderthal populations and opened up a vacant corridor for modern humans to come in. It could be demographic factors, which led to localized extinctions of Neanderthals that allowed modern humans who were slightly more successful to take over these vacant lands. As far as assimilation goes, that's pretty well established now. I mean, there's recent admixture evident in several specimens of modern humans dated to this time frame. Incidentally, none of that shows up in the late Neanderthals, suggesting a one-way flow of genes. The idea of acculturation has been a very hotly debated topic over the years, largely surrounding the issue of the Châtel-Perronian and the sequence of Mousterian, Châtel-Perronian, Aurignacian, and the lack of overlap temporally, or at least stratigraphically, between the Châtel-Perronian and the Aurignacian. However, temporally, the Châtel-Perronian does overlap with that and also the initial Upper Paleolithic, and that opens the window for the possible acculturation of Neanderthal populations. And there are similar elements in the Châtel-Perronian that suggest it's part of this initial Upper Paleolithic that's widespread across Western Eurasia. It also implies the Mandarin evidence implies a shared landscape for thousands of years, that these two populations were interacting with one another for possibly as long as 15,000 years. This time range, of course, is constrained by the new dates from the Grob Mandarin, and also the study done by Hayam et al. Back in 2014, establishing sort of the final boundary age for the Mousterian and, by extension, the Neanderthals. According to the study, the Neanderthals and Middle Paleolithic ended sometime around 40,000 years ago. That may be a little bit earlier now. The dates from SPE have been pushed back a little bit further with refinements in radiocarbon dating, and it may occur with other sites. And so this 40,000 boundary may be pushed back even further as we go forward in time. One of the peculiarities of this study was how they dealt with, or were unable really to deal with, the record from the southern portion of the Iberian Peninsula. The inset map shows several sites noted there, but they're not incorporated into this Bayesian model because of the uncertainties over the accuracy and reliability of the radiocarbon dates. This uncertainty, of course, stems from the widespread occurrence of a number of Middle Paleolithic sites below the Ebro River in Iberia that produced radiometric dates, mostly radiocarbon dates, that post-dated 40,000 years ago or so, and all the way down to 28,000 in some cases, like in Gorham's Cave. Many of these determinations were based on older radiocarbon methods and techniques of pretreatment. They did not utilize some of the improvements such as the ABOX and ultrafiltration that have produced slightly older radiocarbon dates as a result of removal of more recent contaminants. So roughly 20 years ago, when the Ebro frontier hypothesis was put together, you can see that there are a number of sites spread around the coastal margin of Iberia and even up into the central Meseta region. This gave credence to the idea that Neanderthal populations were abundant enough or to hold off against this incursion of modern humans that were coming around the Pyrenees and effectively replacing Neanderthals in those regions with Upper Paleolithic technology. In subsequent years, even prior to 2013, when Rachel Wood and colleagues published their study of radiocarbon dating of the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition in southern Iberia, a number of sites were already undergoing sort of a re-evaluation and a re-dating, if you will. So in recent years, you have the work of Rachel Wood, you've got work by Zliao and by Pedro Cunha and Martin Keel, all to redate using the refinements in radiocarbon dating and also in OSL dating, uranium series, et cetera, to be able to confirm or not these late occurring Middle Paleolithic sites. And what Wood found, at least with the radiocarbon dating, was that there was really no good solid evidence for the survival of the Middle Paleolithic beyond about 42,000 years ago. And she put together three fairly simple hypotheses. One, that the southern region of Iberia was abandoned by both Neanderthals and modern humans, that no one existed. Another, that Neanderthals were present, whether modern humans were there or not. And then the third one is that modern humans were present and that they arrived soon after they arrived in northern Iberia and spread rapidly, just as they had in all other regions. The result was then that all of these black dots turned to blue, that they ended up now predating about 45,000 years ago, give or take a couple of millennia. Also, in the meantime, you have the publication by Cortes et al. On the sort of early Aurignacian dates for Bajandillo, and also our work at the Lapa de Picareiru, which shows early Upper Paleolithic occupations at both sites predating about 40,000 years ago. So this is now the situation that we're left with. Most all of those purportedly late Mousterian occupations are now shown to be much older. So when you look at Middle Paleolithic sites post-dating about 40,000 years ago, there are only a couple of sites left that fall within that time frame, and we have an equal number of early Upper Paleolithic sites that date to 40 or even predate 40,000 years ago. And so this raises all kinds of potential issues. Number one, are these really late Neanderthals the last holdouts, these populations that are on the verge of extinction? And these are just the last two appearance dates. We know from, for instance, from El Cedrón and the study there that Neanderthal populations were suffering from malnutrition and interbreeding and other problems that we could link with perhaps impending extinction. Or are these just instances where the dating needs to be redone to see if it really does hold up that these are less than 40,000 years ago? And then, of course, on the other side of this is where are the other early Upper Paleolithic sites for the region? We have a number of complicating factors when dealing with the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition in Western Iberia. We've already discussed the lack of reliable dates. There's a lot of sample contamination by younger carbon-14. You also have poor bone collagen preservation in many of the depositional environments. And perhaps the most important aspect, though, is the issue of environmental forcing and the stratigraphic discontinuities that have been observed by Mayol et al. And also Aubry et al. Both authors, show that there were major discontinuities at the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition, and in most cases, likely that the abrupt climate shifts, Heinrich events, or the transition between these abrupt climate shifts led to widespread erosive episodes on the landscape that simply erased much of the archaeological record. It's very clear from doing survey across southern Iberia that there are few, if any, well-developed paleosols dated to the late Pleistocene. So this is a time period of pretty significant landscape instability that's brought on by this constant fluctuation in climate. We also have the added problem I alluded to earlier in pointing out the pioneer phase of Davy's model, is that many of the assemblages that could possibly date to this time frame may not be recognized simply because they lack the diagnostic types or elements that would be that would allow archaeologists to assign them to a particular techno-complex. In these early pioneer phases of colonization, it's perhaps likely that people were utilizing raw material, local raw material, expediently and not creating many of the idealized types or utilizing particular technologies. Why might that be the case? Well, it may be the case that Neanderthals were largely gone from the landscape, so they had no one to learn from. So they had to sort of relearn the landscape on their own, so to speak. So where should we expect to find sites that document the early arrival of modern humans? Well, it's apparent from most of what we know about human colonization and dispersal that the riparian zones and coastal environments and river systems are the conduits for this type of movement of peoples. There are ongoing surveys in the south and also in the central portion of Iberia that may reveal some of these earliest Upper Paleolithic incursions into Iberia and help confirm the antiquity of human presence in this area. So with that, I'm just going to leave it here for discussion, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much to our speakers, Erella and Jonathan. So if you'd now like to write your questions in the chat box, and we can, we don't have Erella joining us, unfortunately, but Jonathan, I'm sure will take your questions, and we can start to have a bit of a debate between us. I mean, I think really this first talk has charted a major stage of dispersal in the human journey. Erella began with the very complex story in the Levant, and Jonathan's talk took us through to the tail end of this process at the other side of Europe. So hopefully that's given everyone some food for thought. I can kick things off with a question while everyone's ideas settle. So Jonathan, for a long time, research has been orientated towards the question of how early modern humans were in Europe. And obviously we can't expect to keep pushing that back further and further forever. So what do you think the next kind of key direction is for our research to really deepen our understanding of the finer mechanisms of dispersal?
Well, age control is always going to be an issue. It's always central to this, right? Because I mean, if you don't know when something happened, you can't really talk about what happened. But I mean, we see these just amazing developments, in proteomics and ancient DNA analyses, and pretty soon we're going to have a pretty widespread record, I think, from proteomics and ancient DNA from a lot of the sites that are maybe older sites and new sites that are coming, that we're just going to have a better understanding of who made what and where. And of course, the temporal side will continue to improve as well. So I think that, I mean, these are, I mean, there's a kind of a symbiosis, if you will, right? The laboratory techniques, these innovations and methods, but we still need new sites, because so many of the sites that have been excavated across Europe were either totally excavated and there's nothing left to dig, or they're hopelessly, disturbed, right? And so we constantly need new settings. So there's still field work and survey and excavation that needs to be done. That answered your question.
I'm muted. That's great. Thank you. Sarah, would you like to ask your question now?
Yeah, sure. I haven't gotten any questions from anybody, but please send them forward, because we don't all just want to listen to me talk. But one thing, thank you, Jonathan, for your great presentation. And one thing that kind of jumped out to me, maybe just because it's not something that I've actively worked on, but this idea of Neanderthals in Europe being facilitators of early modern human dispersal. And for those of you that don't know, like my PhD thesis was kind of on Neanderthals and modern humans in Germany. And so I thought a lot about what it would look like if they were competing for resources, if the climate had driven one of them out versus the other. I guess I haven't given as much thought, and probably some people who are in attendance today have, as much thought to what it would look like if Neanderthals and modern humans were working together. And obviously the transitional industries, could be kind of supporting that kind of a pattern. But, what else, maybe you could make a statement about like what else you think we would see archaeologically if Neanderthals are facilitating modern human expansion. Because you kind of played this comparison between Europe and Iberia, right? Unless I completely misunderstood the talk. So what's different between Western Europe and Iberia at this time that could be, due to the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans?
The big thing is there's no, I recognize, transitional industry in Iberia, except for along, the northern strip, right, which was always not an issue there. But in the southern portion, beyond the Ebro, there's not any recognized Chattelperronian or any other IUP kind of industry, right? So that's where you would, I think, expect to see, if that's related to any kind of contact, acculturation, whatever, you'd expect to see that, but there isn't that. And now there may be a substantial temporal gap between these later Neanderthal dates or Middle Paleolithic site dates and the appearance of the Upper Paleolithic. So it's entirely plausible. I mean, it's so wide open. I think this landscape issue is a very significant one, right? And that may, it's a miracle that we have any of the sites that we do, probably, given how much landscape transformation there's been. I mean, it's not just, the climate change. You think about, the population today and over, let's say, the last 150 years of, investigation of this, right? And I mean, there are vast areas that are covered by cities and by towns and have been under continuous, mechanical, agricultural production, I mean, and quarrying, and the destruction of caves, and even in the time since, cultural heritage has been respected or sort of respected, you've seen the destruction of caves, and you'll continue to see that, where people don't want to report something because it's going to stop their operation, right? This sort of thing happens in the United States all along, and it's happening in Europe too. But so yeah, so I mean, you think about where are the places that people could live, and everybody today is living in a pretty good places, obviously for agriculture and for commerce and things like that. But those were always going to be good places for people to live. There's a great study by João Luís Cardoso of it's a historiography, really, in a way, of the Mousterian in the Lisbon region, and it's amazing how many finds of Middle Paleolithic artifacts and things like that are all over what is now the whole urban core, including the suburbs of Lisbon. And that just happened within really decades, I guess. And you think about how many other cities are like that too, how many other big towns. So the more we pave over, the less we're going to be able to find, right? So that's also a big limiting factor, I think.
Thanks. Very important points. Anna has a question. And she is sitting next to the computer that's hosting, so there might be a bit of
into this computer and
sound issue.
Emily's computer.
Pull your chair over there.
I'm here. Well, my question is related to what you say, because you were talking about there are many sites that maybe we don't know. And I've seen this map of Iberia you put with all the northern sites and the Mediterranean sites. And I was wondering, in these regions, in the Mediterranean and in the Cantabric area, we have a historical tradition in archaeology with plenty of sites, really well studied. And I was wondering that maybe this gap in Central Iberia is not related to the lack of sites or the lack of occupations there, but to the lack of tradition in research in this area, right?
Absolutely.
But I don't know if it can be also linked with maybe there are more open air sites in this area which are less preserved. What do you think about that?
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I mean, I think that's also been something that people have argued before too. Yeah, I mean, the places that people were looking were close to their institution, right? You know, and in the case of Portugal and Extremadura, right, you had, you know, some guys from the Geologic Service, right, and they found a lot of early stuff. I mean, a lot. And it wasn't maybe but an hour out of Lisbon, but it's also in a place where you had lots of caves. The geology was right for it, so they're everywhere. And then you also have really good, you know, raw material, good chert sources and stuff. And so, you know, it was kind of easy and comfortable, you know, and you know, a lot of survey, you know, tends to be just sort of, you know, let's go back and see if the site that was found 100 years ago is still there, and, you know, developing sort of predictive models about where sites might be located and going out and testing that. It's a fairly new phenomenon, I think. And also now you're also looking at a lot more investigators, right? You know, back in there's only so much a person could do within their lifetime, their career. So that's also limiting where and how much they're going to be able to do survey, right? So, you know, now with this massive increase in population and an increase in the production of university degree holders, and, you know, the competition and need for you know, grants and doing, you know, field work and stuff to find new sites and carve out a new sort of territory for your own career development. That's also happening now, and I think that's also part of why we're starting to see the discovery of more and more new sites.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now, João Castellier is going to jump in here. He's just been awarded an ERC grant to investigate Neanderthals in Iberia. So, João, let me put you on the spotlight so you can say your piece.
Yeah, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, a little echo.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Hi Jonathan. Thanks. Brilliant presentation. Yeah, so we have this new project. So hopefully we're going to solve some of these problems, or at least try to solve them in the next 5 years. I have a question for Jonathan, which is, so in the limiting aspects of that you showed up in one of the slides, you didn't mention an alternative hypothesis, which is the very late Neanderthals might have completely changed their settlement system. And this has been proposed lately by João Leão in the Oliveira, was last year, I think, yeah, about the Gruta de Oliveira, in which he proposes that, so these very late Neanderthals were not using caves, they were using mostly open air sites in coastal settings. And when they use caves, they're pretty much located in these very specific regions, these very specific valleys. So my question is, what do you think about this? Do you agree with this? Is it plausible that Neanderthals completely abandoned most of the caves that they have been using for forever?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I suppose part of that's based on the fact that when they redated Oliveira again, that it's now last interglacial in age. So it's no longer a late site. And the other caves like Colombeira that were thought to be late, Figueira Brava that was thought to be late, are no longer late, not even close, right? But the sites that are close, Foz and Schriek is not late anymore, but it's still MIS3, and it's in the 40s, maybe, you know, 40s to 50. And the site we excavated a few years back near Nascent on the coast, we have OSL dates of 40 to 42 and identical radiocarbon dates. And so, you know, and that's a, you know, it's probably within a few kilometers of where the shoreline was at the time. So there's, you know, that's certainly a plausible thing. You know, I just think there's so few of these Middle Paleolithic sites that have age control that we can't really say what's late and what's early anymore. I mean, for so long, those sites I'd mentioned before were considered, oh yes, rock solid. We know they're late. They're 37,000, they're whatever thousand, and they're tens of thousands of years older, with different dating techniques. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of radiometric dating. OSL is, I think, revolutionized Iberian archaeology, really, because it's been able to show not just for archaeology, but also for landscape histories and stuff. You think about the work of, Wolf in Central Iberia, documenting, landscape history across MIS 3 and 2. We've done some of that. We published like 60 plus OSL ages for open air localities in Estremadura, some of which had archaeology, and most of those landscape surfaces that we dated were actually very late Pleistocene. So we just still need a lot more field work, sampling, application of dating techniques that work in the open air to be able to address that. I mean, it's an idea, and it's worth testing, right? It's a hypothesis out there, so there may be something to it. I don't know.
So we've got another question from our other ERC here at ICArEHB. I will just make Vera a spotlight, and Vera, go ahead.
You are muted.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's like the 2021 most said sentence, right? You're muted. So I was thanking you for your talk. It was really interesting in Erella when it was really nice, and too bad that she cannot be here. We wish her recovery. So my question is, thinking about the results you have from Picareiro, that let's assume that they are correct, right? And so you do have an overlap in time, for sure, with some sites, right? The Mousterian sites. So something that always bugged me, and I always talk with you guys, the lithics people, is that if you start having overlap, and why don't we have at all a transitional industry in Iberia? It's everywhere else, so why not here?
So the overlap issue that I raised in that article was mainly because of Oliveira. And at the time, that hadn't been published. And so now that it's much older, I'm not sure I see any overlap anywhere. I mean, Joas just recently published the Colorado stuff, but I'm not sure that those dates are really that accurate.
I guess I mean overlap more in Iberia sense, because you still have Calvanton and all that would still overlap.
Right. And that's, okay, so I go back and look at what Rachel Wood said about that. And basically she left that one open, right? As, okay, well, this is one we can't really explain away with any obvious contamination or anything. So that may be a legitimate one. And I know that, even though, there hasn't been any new dating attempts, I guess, at Gorham's that I know of, that's still there, as a possibility. And Finlayson's made a lot off of that, right? I mean, it is the last little redoubt. It's just like the, Andalusian kingdom in 1492 in Granada holding out, and maybe that's it. But yeah, again, are they in contact, and what does that look like if they are? Going back to the previous question, there's just no transitional, evidence. But again, we don't know what hominin is associated with what lithic assemblage here. We have so few remains, and ancient DNA attempts and proteomics attempts are really just now beginning or ongoing, right? So that's just going to change a lot of things, I have a feeling, in the next few years. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does in a sense, but it still bugs me.
Well, yeah.
It still bugs me that we don't have a transitional anything here. But I agree completely that we don't know who did what, and some
secretly hoping that the upper portion of level JJ and Picareiro is going to produce a little Chatel Peronian thing or something. I'm not really counting on that.
I think to sort of round things off, that question of who made what is really pertinent to thinking back to the Levantine record as well. We still don't know in a lot of cases. So hopefully the advances in these ancient DNA and other proteomics techniques will help us to elucidate things in the next few years. So I think it's probably time to wrap things up. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to Erella, and we wish you a speedy recovery. You can join us for our next dialogues on the 22nd of April, where we will have Alice Leplongeon and Kurt Rademacher discussing migrations and dispersals in the late Pleistocene. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.